Some animals don't become dangerous because they were born that way. They become dangerous because people gave them every reason to stop trusting the world. The security camera inside the shelter had recorded hundreds of sad moments over the years: abandoned puppies left in cardboard boxes, injured strays trembling in the rain, old dogs staring silently at the front gate after their owners never came back. But what happened that stormy Thursday night was something none of the staff would ever forget. Rain hammered against the metal roof of Greenridge Animal Shelter just outside of Cedar Falls, Iowa, while thunder rattled the windows hard enough to make several dogs bark in panic. Hannah Parker pulled her hoodie tighter as she hurried across the hallway carrying a stack of blankets toward the isolation room. The shelter was overcrowded again. Almost 30 animals over capacity after a recent flood forced dozens of families to surrender pets they could no longer care for. Every kennel was full. Every hallway smelled faintly of wet fur, disinfectant, and exhaustion. Hannah had worked there for 4 years, and she had never seen things this bad. Then the front door burst open. Mike Donovan, the night manager, stepped inside, dripping wet from head to toe while carrying a soaked cardboard box against his chest. "You gotta be kidding me," Hannah muttered as she rushed over to help him. Mike set the box carefully on the front counter, and a tiny sound immediately came from inside, weak, shaky, almost too soft to hear over the storm. Hannah slowly lifted the damp flaps and froze. Curled inside the box was a tiny orange and white kitten no bigger than a soda bottle, its fur soaked flat against its body, its little sides barely moving as it struggled to breathe. "Someone left him outside the gate," Mike said quietly. "He would have died out there tonight." Hannah gently reached toward the kitten, but it suddenly let out a faint cry and tried to crawl deeper into the corner of the box. Its paws were trembling violently from the cold. "We need a heated kennel now," she said. Mike rubbed both hands down his tired face before glancing toward the packed rows of cages behind them. "There are no open kennels." Hannah stared at him. "Then make one." Mike lowered his voice. "We've already got 3 dogs in temporary crates, Hannah. There's literally nowhere left." Another clap of thunder shook the building. The kitten flinched so hard it nearly tipped over sideways. Hannah's stomach tightened. "We can't leave him out here." Mike looked toward the back hallway for several long seconds before speaking again. "Only one cage has extra space." Hannah followed his eyes instantly, and her expression changed. "No, it's temporary." "Absolutely not." Mike sighed heavily. "Bruno's the only dog in the shelter with a double enclosure." Hannah stepped back immediately. "That dog nearly scared a volunteer half to death last month. He didn't hurt anybody. Because we stopped him in time." Even saying Bruno's name made the atmosphere feel colder. Everyone at Greenridge knew the massive black shepherd mix in Kennel 14. Nearly 100 pounds of muscle, scars, and silence. Bruno never barked like the other dogs. He just watched people with those dark eyes that made even experienced staff uncomfortable. No family had ever managed to adopt him. No foster home kept him longer than 2 days. According to his paperwork, Bruno had been rescued from an illegal fighting operation almost 3 years earlier, though nobody knew exactly what had happened to him there. All they knew was this: Bruno trusted nobody. Hannah looked back down at the kitten whose tiny body was still shaking uncontrollably. "If you put that kitten in Bruno's cage, he's not going to survive the night." Mike hesitated only a moment before lifting the cardboard box again. "We don't have another choice." Hannah followed Mike down the narrow back hallway with her heart pounding harder after every step. Rainwater dripped from the cardboard box onto the concrete floor, while the tiny kitten inside let out weak little cries that sounded smaller each time. The farther they walked, the louder the barking became from the surrounding kennels, but one cage remained completely silent. Kennel 14 sat at the very end of the row beneath a flickering overhead light. Bruno was already awake. The massive shepherd mix stood motionless behind the chain-link gate, his dark eyes fixed directly on the box in Mike's hands. Hannah immediately stopped walking. "He knows something is different," she whispered nervously. Bruno slowly stepped closer to the front of the enclosure. His broad shoulders rolled with controlled tension, and the low rumble coming from his chest barely sounded like a growl at all. It sounded deeper, more like a warning. Mike swallowed hard but kept moving. "Just stay calm." "Calm?" Hannah shot back quietly. "Mike, look at him." Bruno's scarred ears tilted forward slightly as the kitten cried again from inside the box. The dog's breathing changed instantly. He moved faster now, pacing once along the gate before stopping again directly in front of them. Hannah had seen aggressive dogs before, but Bruno was different. Most angry dogs barked wildly or threw themselves against cages. Bruno never wasted energy. He simply stared, and somehow that was worse. Mike unlocked the outer latch carefully while keeping his body tense. I am only setting the kitten inside for a few minutes until we figure something else out. Hannah grabbed his arm. This is a mistake. But before Mike could answer, the kitten suddenly made a soft, choking sound from inside the box. Both of them looked down immediately. The tiny animal's body was trembling harder than before. He is freezing, Hannah whispered. Mike exhaled slowly. Then we do this now. He opened the outer gate and stepped into the first section of the double enclosure, while Bruno remained completely still in the back half. The giant dog never took his eyes off the box. Hannah stood frozen outside the kennel, every muscle in her body preparing for disaster. Mike carefully lowered the cardboard box onto the floor near the corner divider. Easy, he muttered under his breath. Bruno took one slow step forward. Hannah's pulse jumped. Then another step. The dog's nails clicked softly against the concrete floor while thunder boomed outside the shelter walls. The kitten let out another weak cry. Bruno stopped moving. For several seconds, nobody breathed. Hannah tightened her grip around the radio clipped to her jacket, ready to call for help. Then Bruno lowered his head slightly and sniffed the air toward the box. His growling stopped completely. Why did he stop? Hannah whispered. Mike did not answer. Bruno moved closer again, but this time something about his posture looked different. The tension in his shoulders faded. His ears lowered. He stared down at the shaking box for several long moments before doing something nobody expected. Very slowly, the massive dog lowered himself onto the concrete floor directly beside the kitten. Hannah blinked in confusion. What is he doing? Bruno stretched his body along the side of the box without touching it. The kitten cried softly again, and the dog immediately lifted his head toward the sound. Then Bruno looked up at Mike. Not angrily, not aggressively, almost cautiously. Mike stared back in disbelief. I do not think he wants us near it, he said quietly. Hannah took one careful step toward the cage. Instantly Bruno stood up again and released a deep warning growl that echoed through the kennel room. Hannah backed away immediately. Bruno stopped growling the second she stepped back. Then he turned around, circled once beside the box, and lay down again even closer than before. The little cries coming from inside the cardboard box slowly became quieter while Bruno remained completely still beside it. Hannah felt chills run down her arms that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Mike, she whispered nervously, unable to look away from the cage. I do not think Bruno is guarding himself anymore. For nearly an hour, the storm continued pounding the shelter while Bruno refused to move away from the cardboard box. Hannah sat at the security desk watching the kennel camera feed with growing confusion. Every few minutes she expected something terrible to happen. One sudden movement, one frightened cry from the kitten, one aggressive reaction from Bruno, but none of it came. Instead, the giant dog remained stretched protectively beside the box, as though guarding something precious. This does not make sense, Hannah whispered quietly. Mike leaned against the counter with a cup of stale coffee in his hands, staring at the same monitor. I have never seen him act like this before. Neither had she. Bruno normally avoided every animal in the shelter. During feeding time, he turned his body away from neighboring kennels. During walks, he ignored every dog that barked at him. It was almost as if he had built invisible walls around himself years ago and never allowed anyone through them again. Yet now he had not taken his eyes off that tiny kitten for almost 60 straight minutes. Hannah finally stood up. I am checking on them again. Be careful, Mike warned immediately. Hannah nodded before making her way back down the dim hallway. The barking from the other dogs had settled into occasional restless sounds, but Kennel 14 remained strangely quiet. When Hannah approached the cage, Bruno instantly lifted his head. The dog did not growl this time, but his eyes followed her every movement carefully. Hannah stopped several feet from the gate. Easy, Bruno, she whispered softly. The kitten suddenly released a weak little sneeze from inside the box. Bruno immediately turned his attention back toward the sound. Hannah noticed something, then that made her pause. The cardboard box had moved. Earlier it sat near the corner divider several feet from Bruno's bed area, but now it rested directly beside the large gray blanket in the back section of the enclosure. Mike, She called quietly over her shoulder. Did you move the box? No, he answered from farther down the hall. Hannah stared at Bruno. Then how did it get over there? Bruno slowly lowered his head beside the box again, almost as if pretending not to notice her question. Hannah carefully crouched near the kennel gate for a better look. The kitten was no longer curled tightly into itself like before. Tiny Milo now rested partly wrapped against the edge of Bruno's blanket, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, the little animal did not appear to be shaking. Hannah felt a knot tighten in her chest. Oh my God, she whispered under her breath. Bruno had moved the kitten. Somehow, gently and carefully, the massive dog had dragged the cardboard box closer to the warmest spot inside the enclosure. Mike stepped beside her, staring silently through the gate. That cannot be normal behavior, he muttered. Hannah almost answered when a sudden crash echoed from the front lobby. One of the younger volunteers had dropped a metal food bucket. Several dogs immediately exploded into loud barking throughout the building. Milo startled awake inside the box with a frightened cry. In less than 1 second, Bruno jumped to his feet. Hannah instinctively backed away from the kennel, expecting aggression, but Bruno did not lunge toward the kitten. Instead, he turned toward the hallway and barked loudly for the very first time all night. It was not an angry bark. It sounded defensive, protective. The noise startled everyone in the shelter because Bruno almost never barked at all. Then something even stranger happened. The tiny kitten slowly crawled out of the box for the first time and pressed itself against Bruno's front leg. The giant dog immediately lowered his head over the kitten protectively while staring down the hallway toward the noise. Hannah felt goosebumps spread across both arms. He thinks the kitten is scared, she whispered. Mike looked genuinely unsettled now. No, he replied quietly while watching Bruno shield the tiny orange kitten with his own body. I think he is scared something is going to happen to it. By midnight, the storm outside had finally begun to weaken, but nobody at Greenridge Animal Shelter felt relaxed anymore. Every employee working the late shift kept finding reasons to walk past Kennel 14 just to look inside again. None of them could understand what they were seeing. Bruno, the dog nobody trusted, had not left the kitten's side for hours. Even stranger, Milo seemed completely calm around him now. The tiny orange kitten had curled against Bruno's chest, as though the massive dog was the safest place in the world. Hannah stood near the kennel entrance watching quietly while Dr. Carter arrived for the emergency overnight checkup. The older veterinarian had been called in after Mike explained over the phone that a hypothermic stray kitten had been rescued during the storm. But even before Dr. Carter examined Milo, Hannah could tell his attention had already shifted toward Bruno. That is him, the veterinarian asked softly while staring through the chain-link gate. The fighting rescue dog? Mike nodded. You should have seen him earlier. We thought he was going to attack the kitten. Dr. Carter remained silent for several seconds. Bruno noticed the unfamiliar voice immediately and slowly rose to his feet. Milo stayed tucked against the blanket behind him while the dog moved closer to the gate. Hannah instinctively stiffened again. Careful, she warned quietly. But Bruno did not bark. He simply positioned himself between the veterinarian and the kitten. Dr. Carter studied the dog carefully. Interesting, he murmured. He is guarding. Hannah folded her arms. That is exactly what scares me. The veterinarian glanced at her. No, a truly aggressive dog does not guard like this. Before Hannah could answer, Milo suddenly let out a tiny cough from the back of the enclosure. Bruno instantly turned around and hurried back toward the kitten. The giant dog lowered himself beside Milo again and gently nudged the small animal with his nose. Hannah's eyes widened slightly. Did you see that? Mike whispered. Dr. Carter nodded slowly. Yes, and I think I know why this dog is acting differently tonight. The veterinarian crouched carefully outside the kennel while Bruno watched every movement. Dogs that survive severe trauma sometimes form protective bonds with vulnerable animals, he explained quietly, especially animals smaller or weaker than themselves. Hannah looked unconvinced. You are saying Bruno suddenly became nurturing? No, Dr. Carter replied softly. I am saying this kitten may have triggered something emotional in him. Bruno shifted slightly beside Milo, keeping one paw stretched protectively near the kitten's body. The tiny orange cat pressed closer into the thick fur around Bruno's chest. Hannah could barely believe the sight in front of her. Earlier that same evening, she had been certain the kitten would not survive the night. Now Milo looked safer than any animal in the building. Then everything changed again. A loud metallic bang suddenly echoed from the supply room down the hall. One of the storage shelves had collapsed. The noise exploded through the shelter like a gunshot. Dogs immediately erupted into frantic barking throughout the building. Milo jerked awake in panic with a frightened cry. Bruno reacted instantly. The giant dog jumped to his feet so fast that his food bowl flipped across the floor. His deep bark thundered through the kennel room while he positioned himself directly over the kitten. Hannah froze. "Bruno," Mike shouted nervously. But the dog was no longer looking at the staff. He stared down the hallway toward the sound with every muscle in his body tense. Milo tried to stumble closer beneath Bruno's chest as the barking continued around them. Then Hannah noticed something that made her heart skip. Bruno was shaking. Very slightly, almost invisibly beneath his thick black fur, the massive dog was trembling. Dr. Carter slowly stood beside her. "He is not threatening the kitten," the veterinarian said quietly. "He is afraid for it." Hannah stared speechless through the gate. Bruno remained standing protectively over Milo while chaos echoed throughout the shelter. And for the first time since arriving at Greenridge years ago, the huge scarred dog no longer looked dangerous to her at all. He looked terrified of losing something. The shelter slowly grew quieter after the storage room accident, but nobody working the overnight shift could stop thinking about Bruno. Even the newer volunteers who normally refused to walk near Kennel 14 kept finding excuses to peek inside. Each time they looked, they saw the same impossible scene. The massive black dog remained curled protectively around the tiny orange kitten as though nothing else in the world mattered anymore. Around 2:30 in the morning, Hannah returned with a fresh bowl of water and a heating pad Dr. Carter wanted placed beneath Milo's blanket. She moved carefully through the hallway while Bruno watched her approach through half-open eyes. The dog had not slept once all night. Every sound still made his ears twitch instantly. Hannah crouched a few feet outside the kennel. "Bruno," she said softly. "I need to help him." The dog did not move. Milo stirred weakly against Bruno's chest and let out a tiny squeaking sound. Hannah slowly slid the heating pad through the lower gap beneath the gate using a long wooden handle. Bruno immediately stood up. The deep growl returned at once. Hannah froze. "Easy," she whispered. Bruno stepped closer to the gate, placing himself between Hannah and the kitten again. His posture was tense but uncertain, almost conflicted. He wanted to protect Milo, but he also seemed exhausted from staying alert for so many hours. Dr. Carter appeared beside Hannah carrying a flashlight and several old shelter files tucked beneath one arm. "Do not push him," the veterinarian warned quietly. "Let him decide you are safe." Hannah looked down at the files. "What are those?" Dr. Carter exhaled heavily before answering. "Bruno's original rescue records." Mike stepped closer from behind them. "I thought most of his history was missing." "Most of it is," Dr. Carter replied. "But there were a few notes from the rescue team that brought him in." The veterinarian opened one of the folders carefully while Bruno continued watching every movement. When Animal Control found Bruno 3 years ago, he was discovered inside an abandoned warehouse during a winter raid. Hannah listened quietly while keeping her eyes on the kennel. "The officers reported something unusual," Dr. Carter continued softly. "Bruno was not alone." Mike frowned. "Another dog." The veterinarian shook his head slowly. "A litter of newborn puppies." Hannah turned toward him immediately. "Puppies?" Dr. Carter nodded. "According to the report, Bruno refused to leave them even after rescuers entered the building. The puppies were severely malnourished and freezing. The officers believed Bruno had spent days trying to keep them warm." Hannah stared back toward the kennel where Milo now slept curled against Bruno's front leg. "Did the puppy survive?" For several seconds, Dr. Carter said nothing. Then he quietly closed the folder. "No." The hallway fell silent except for the distant sound of rain dripping outside the shelter roof. Hannah looked back at Bruno differently now. The giant dog slowly lowered himself beside Milo again, never taking his eyes off the staff. Suddenly the behavior from earlier no longer seemed random. It felt personal, deeply personal. Mike rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. "So you think he sees the kitten the same way?" "I think," Dr. Carter answered carefully, "that Bruno recognizes something helpless and cold and alone." Milo shifted weakly in his sleep and pressed closer into Bruno's thick fur. The dog immediately lowered his head protectively over the tiny kitten again. Hannah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Then Milo suddenly coughed again, this time harder than before. Bruno reacted instantly. He nudged the kitten gently with his nose once, then twice, before looking toward the staff with visible panic in his eyes. Hannah had never seen a dog communicate emotion so clearly before. Bruno was asking for help. "Doctor," she whispered urgently. "Something is wrong." Dr. Carter moved toward the gate carefully while Bruno stood frozen beside Milo. For one tense moment, Hannah thought the dog might block him again. Instead, Bruno stepped aside slightly, just enough for the veterinarian to reach through the lower opening with a stethoscope. Dr. Carter listened silently for several seconds before his face changed completely. "We need to warm this kitten up immediately," he said sharply. "If his temperature drops any lower, he may not make it through the night." The moment Bruno heard the fear in the veterinarian's voice, the giant dog pressed himself tightly against Milo once more as though refusing to let the cold reach him again. The next hour became a race against time. Dr. Carter brought portable heaters into the kennel room while Hannah warmed blankets in the shelter dryer as fast as possible. Milo's tiny body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and every minute mattered now. Yet through all the urgency and movement around him, Bruno refused to leave the kitten's side for even a second. The giant dog followed every motion the staff made with nervous eyes, staying pressed tightly against Milo, as though his own body was the only thing keeping the tiny kitten alive. "We have to get fluids into him," Dr. Carter said quietly while preparing a small syringe of warmed formula near the kennel gate. "But if Bruno panics, this becomes impossible." Hannah looked toward the enclosure nervously. Bruno had not growled again since the veterinarian examined Milo earlier, but the dog remained intensely alert. Every time someone stepped too close, his ears lifted immediately. "Maybe he trusts you now," Hannah suggested carefully. Dr. Carter shook his head. "No, he trusts the kitten." The veterinarian slowly crouched near the lower opening beneath the gate while speaking softly toward Bruno. "You are helping him, buddy. We are helping him too." Bruno stared silently back at him. Milo barely moved anymore. The tiny kitten lay weakly against Bruno's chest beneath the thick blanket, while shallow breaths lifted his little body. Hannah felt fear building inside her chest. She had rescued dozens of abandoned animals over the years, but something about this felt different. The entire shelter now seemed emotionally tied to whether Milo survived the night. And somehow Bruno appeared to understand that too. Dr. Carter carefully slid the syringe through the opening toward the kitten. Bruno immediately lowered his head over Milo protectively. "Easy," the veterinarian whispered. For several tense seconds nobody moved. Then Bruno slowly shifted aside just enough for the syringe to reach the kitten. Hannah stared in disbelief. "He understands," she whispered. Milo weakly swallowed a few drops of formula while Bruno watched every second closely. The giant dog remained completely still until the veterinarian carefully pulled the syringe back out again. Then Bruno immediately nudged the kitten gently with his nose as if checking whether Milo was all right. Mike shook his head from across the hallway. "I swear this dog acts more like a worried parent than half the people I know." But the most shocking moment came nearly 20 minutes later. Hannah had just returned from the laundry room carrying fresh heated blankets when she noticed Bruno behaving strangely. The dog stood near the kennel door, staring upward toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Then he looked back down at Milo before pacing once across the enclosure. "What is he doing now?" Mike asked quietly. Bruno suddenly approached the metal gate and began pawing lightly near the bottom latch. Not aggressively, intentionally. Hannah set the blankets down slowly. "Wait." Bruno pawed at the latch again, then looked directly at Hannah before glancing back toward the kitten. Dr. Carter stepped closer, studying the behavior carefully. "I think he wants something." "What?" Mike asked. Hannah's eyes widened suddenly. "The heating pad." Earlier they had placed the warming pad outside the enclosure after Bruno became protective near the gate. Hannah quickly grabbed it from the nearby counter and slowly slid it beneath the opening. Bruno immediately stopped pawing the latch. The dog carefully dragged the heating pad across the floor using his mouth before placing it directly beside Milo's blanket. Then, incredibly, Bruno laid down with the kitten positioned between his chest and the warmth of the heating pad. The entire hallway fell silent. Even Dr. Carter looked stunned now. "That is not random behavior," the veterinarian whispered. Hannah could barely process what she was seeing. Bruno had understood exactly what the kitten needed. More than that, he had found a way to ask for help without threatening anyone. Milo let out the faintest little sound before pressing weakly closer against Bruno's fur. The giant dog lowered his head protectively over the tiny kitten once again, while rain continued dripping softly outside the shelter windows. Then Hannah noticed tears forming in Mike's eyes as he quietly stared through the kennel gate. "All this time," he said softly, "we thought Bruno was dangerous because he hated the world." He swallowed hard before looking back toward the dog curled protectively around the kitten. But maybe he was just heartbroken. By 4 in the morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving the shelter wrapped in an eerie silence broken only by the occasional hum of the heating system. Most of the dogs had settled back to sleep, but nobody in the building felt tired anymore. Hannah sat cross-legged near Kennel 14, watching Bruno and Milo through the gate, as though afraid the moment might disappear if she looked away. The giant black dog had not slept once. Every few minutes, he carefully nudged the tiny kitten closer toward the heating pad or adjusted his body to keep Milo surrounded by warmth. And slowly, almost unbelievably, the kitten's breathing had become steadier. Dr. Carter checked Milo's temperature again just before dawn. This time, when he looked at the thermometer, relief finally crossed his face. "He is stabilizing," the veterinarian whispered. Hannah let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. "So he is going to make it?" Dr. Carter nodded carefully. "I think Bruno bought him enough time." Hannah looked back toward the kennel and felt her chest tighten emotionally. The giant dog was watching the veterinarian closely again, waiting for some sign that the kitten was safe. "He knows," she whispered softly. "He absolutely knows." Mike walked into the hallway carrying fresh coffee for everyone before stopping in front of the kennel again. Even after hours of watching Bruno, he still looked stunned by what he saw. "I called the morning staff already," he said quietly. "Nobody believes me." Hannah almost smiled for the first time all night. "Honestly, I would not believe it either." Just then Milo stirred beneath the blanket and let out a tiny squeak. Bruno immediately lowered his head toward the kitten. Then something happened that made Hannah cover her mouth in shock. The little orange kitten slowly climbed forward using shaky paws and pressed directly against Bruno's face. The massive dog froze completely still. Milo rubbed his tiny head beneath Bruno's chin before curling against the side of his neck. Bruno's eyes slowly closed for the first time all night. Hannah felt tears instantly burn behind her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. Mike quietly looked away, blinking hard. Even Dr. Carter removed his glasses for a second to wipe his eyes. For years, Bruno had been labeled aggressive, unstable, dangerous, unadoptable. Families walked past his kennel without stopping. Volunteers avoided eye contact with him. Some shelters would have given up on a dog like Bruno long ago. Yet now, the same dog everyone feared sat perfectly motionless because a frightened kitten trusted him completely. As the first pale light of sunrise crept through the shelter windows, Hannah quietly pulled out her phone and checked the overnight security footage again. She wanted to understand everything Bruno had done while they were distracted helping the other animals during the storm. What she found left her speechless. The footage showed Bruno throughout the night repeatedly adjusting the blankets around Milo whenever the kitten became restless. At one point, the heating pad shifted several inches away while Milo slept. Bruno immediately stood up, dragged it back with his mouth, and carefully laid down beside the kitten again. But the hardest moment to watch came around 3:13 in the morning. Milo had stopped moving for nearly 30 terrifying seconds. Bruno immediately began nudging the tiny kitten gently with his nose over and over before placing his entire body around him protectively. Then the kitten finally moved again. Hannah stared at the screen with tears running down her face now. "He thought Milo was dying," she whispered. Dr. Carter looked at the footage beside her and slowly nodded. "And he refused to let him go." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The morning sunlight continued filling the hallway while Bruno rested quietly with the kitten sleeping safely against his chest. Then Mike suddenly cleared his throat. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked softly. Hannah looked at him. Mike stared through the kennel gate with guilt written all over his face. "Yesterday, I was one signature away from transferring Bruno to another facility because nobody wanted him anymore." Hannah felt her stomach drop. Mike swallowed hard before continuing. "If that kitten had not shown up tonight, we never would have known who Bruno really was." By late morning, the storm clouds had completely cleared above Cedar Falls, But inside Greenridge Animal Shelter, nobody could stop talking about Bruno and Milo. Staff members arriving for the day's shift gathered quietly outside Kennel 14 one after another, staring through the gate with expressions that shifted from curiosity to disbelief within seconds. Some of them had worked around Bruno for years without ever seeing him willingly let anyone close. Yet now the giant black dog lay peacefully on his side, while a tiny orange kitten slept stretched across his front paws. The tension that normally surrounded Bruno's kennel had disappeared completely. Even the air felt different. Hannah leaned against the hallway wall, watching new volunteers react to the scene. "That cannot be the same dog," one whispered softly. Another volunteer shook her head in disbelief. "I thought he hated every animal here." Hannah glanced toward Bruno and quietly answered, "I do not think he hated anybody. I think he stopped believing anything good would ever happen again." Inside the kennel, Milo had grown noticeably stronger after several hours of warmth and fluids. The tiny kitten was finally eating small amounts of formula without coughing, and every improvement seemed to relax Bruno a little more. For the first time since the night began, the giant dog had actually fallen asleep for nearly 20 minutes straight. Dr. Carter noticed it immediately. "That tells me everything," he said quietly while reviewing Milo's chart at the nearby counter. Hannah looked up. "What do you mean?" "Bruno stayed awake all night because he thought the kitten was dying," the veterinarian explained. "Now that Milo is stable, his body is finally allowing itself to rest." Hannah glanced back toward the sleeping dog and felt another wave of emotion hit her unexpectedly. The shelter phone suddenly rang from the front office. Mike answered it casually at first, but seconds later his expression changed. "Wait," he said into the receiver. "You saw the video where?" Hannah frowned. "What video?" Mike slowly lowered the phone and looked back toward the kennel hallway. "One of the overnight volunteers uploaded 30 seconds of security footage online this morning." Hannah's eyes widened immediately. "What footage?" Mike turned his phone screen around silently. The video already had thousands of views. It showed Bruno carefully dragging the heating pad closer to Milo during the middle of the night before curling protectively around the tiny kitten. The caption simply read, "Nobody believed this dog had a heart until a freezing stray kitten entered his cage." Hannah covered her mouth in shock. "Oh my God." Mike refreshed the screen again. The numbers kept climbing rapidly. Comments flooded in faster than they could read them. People from all over the country were reacting emotionally to the footage. Some admitted they cried watching Bruno protect the kitten. Others asked if the dog was available for adoption. One comment appeared over and over again. "We judged him wrong." Hannah looked back toward Bruno with tears in her eyes. For years people only saw his scars, his size, his silence. Nobody ever stopped long enough to understand the pain behind his behavior. But somehow one frightened kitten had done what no human ever could. Milo trusted Bruno immediately. And because of that trust, everyone else finally started seeing the dog differently too. Then something happened that nobody expected. Milo slowly woke up from his nap, stretched his tiny paws, and began wobbling clumsily across the blanket toward the kennel gate. Bruno instantly lifted his head in concern and followed close behind him. The little kitten stopped directly in front of Hannah outside the enclosure and let out a soft squeak. Hannah smiled carefully before crouching lower beside the gate. "Hey there, little guy." Milo pressed himself against the chain-link fence without fear. After a moment, Bruno stepped beside him quietly. Hannah slowly extended one finger through the gap beneath the latch. Bruno watched carefully, but did not growl. Milo rubbed his tiny face against Hannah's finger while Bruno remained inches away, calm and silent. Hannah felt tears burn behind her eyes again. "He is letting me near him," she whispered. Dr. Carter smiled softly from behind her. "No," the veterinarian corrected gently. "Bruno is letting you near someone he loves." The hallway fell silent again as everyone watched the giant scarred dog stand protectively beside the tiny kitten who had changed his entire world in less than one night. Over the next several days, Greenridge Animal Shelter received more attention than it had in years. The short security video of Bruno protecting Milo spread across social media faster than anyone expected. Millions of people watched. The giant scarred dog carefully tucked a heating pad beside a freezing stray kitten during the middle of the stormy night. News stations called asking for interviews. Donations poured into the shelter from people across the country. But inside Kennel 14, none of that mattered to Bruno. His entire world still revolved around one tiny orange kitten. By the end of the week, Milo had fully regained his strength. The little kitten now bounced clumsily around the enclosure with endless energy, chasing his own tail, climbing over blankets, and constantly trying to crawl onto Bruno's back. And every single time Milo wandered too far from the bed area, Bruno quietly followed behind him like a shadow. Hannah laughed one afternoon while watching Milo attempt to climb onto the giant dog's head during feeding time. "I cannot believe this is the same animal everybody was afraid of." Mike leaned against the kennel wall, smiling softly. "Honestly, I think Bruno still scares half the town." Hannah glanced through the gate where the massive black dog patiently sat while Milo batted playfully at his ears. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but not the ones who understand him now." The biggest surprise came the following Saturday during the shelter's adoption event. Normally, Bruno stayed hidden in the back hallway during public visits because his size and history made people nervous. But after the video went viral, families specifically asked to meet him. At first, Hannah worried the attention would overwhelm Bruno. Instead, something incredible happened. Whenever Milo sat beside him, Bruno remained calm, relaxed, safe. Children carefully approached the kennel without fear, while parents wiped tears from their eyes watching the tiny kitten curled against the giant dog's chest. One elderly man stood silently outside the enclosure for nearly 10 minutes before finally whispering, "That dog spent his whole life waiting for someone small enough to trust him." Hannah never forgot those words. Late that afternoon, a couple named Daniel and Rebecca Foster arrived at the shelter with their 8-year-old daughter Lily. They had driven nearly 3 hours after seeing Bruno and Milo online. Hannah carefully explained Bruno's past and warned them about his history of fear around strangers. But the moment Lily sat quietly outside the kennel gate, Milo trotted directly toward her without hesitation. Bruno followed behind him slowly. The giant dog studied the little girl carefully while she gently held out her hand through the lower opening beneath the gate. "Hi, Bruno," Lily whispered softly. "You are a good boy." Hannah held her breath. For several long seconds, Bruno simply stared at the child. Then, very slowly, the massive dog walked forward and rested his head gently against the fence beside her hand. Rebecca immediately covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Daniel looked stunned. "I do not think I have ever seen a dog look at someone like that before," he whispered. But the moment that broke everyone came seconds later. Milo climbed directly onto Bruno's back, balanced there clumsily for a second, then curled into a tiny orange ball against the dog's shoulders. Bruno stayed perfectly still to avoid disturbing him. Lily began crying softly. "Please tell me they do not have to be separated." Hannah looked toward Mike across the hallway. The shelter manager quietly shook his head before smiling for the first time in days. "They will not be." 2 weeks later, Bruno and Milo officially left Greenridge Animal Shelter together. As Daniel carried Milo toward the family SUV, Bruno stopped beside the shelter entrance and looked back one last time. Hannah knelt beside him and wrapped both arms around the giant dog's neck. "You saved him," she whispered through tears. Bruno gently pressed his head against her shoulder before turning toward the parking lot where Milo waited inside Lily's arms. The giant dog walked calmly toward his new family without hesitation. Hannah stood there watching until the SUV disappeared down the road beneath the golden Iowa sunset. And even years later, whenever people at Greenridge talked about the most unforgettable rescue they had ever witnessed, nobody remembered the storm first. They remembered the dog everyone called dangerous and the tiny stray kitten who taught him how to trust the world again.